Leo wants to get us started with a little warmer. And
yes, Alberto actually said he's never heard of this Menti. So we're going to go there. So if everyone, if you could just go to www.menti.com and you can type in the code. Oh, Andrew's already there. 518105. Yeah, so I'm going to show you exactly what Menti is. It looks more or less like this, just to kind of give us an idea of where people are coming from. Here we have strongly disagree on one side, strongly agree. And some of the statements we have, there's no difference between online and face-to-face teaching. I'm not comfortable with online teaching, and the tools are more important when teaching online. So we're waiting to see what people are going to say. So far, we have 6 people saying that they strongly agree. I mean, not strongly agree, they agree perhaps that the tools are more important. We have about 7 people say that they strongly disagree. Disagree. Then we have 1 person say that they strongly disagree, but I think this is changing. Let's see. I'm not comfortable with online teaching. A lot of people are saying they're not sure, so they're kind of like on the wall. 6 have said that they are not comfortable. They strongly disagree. They seem to be comfortable, sorry. 8 said they agree. They're not comfortable. And there's no difference between online and face-to-face teaching. I think Mike has kind of touched upon this, but the idea of this session is to actually prove to you that there is actually not much of a difference between online teaching and face-to-face teaching. The second aim of our session is actually to make everyone feel slightly more, if you are feeling uncomfortable with online teaching, we hope that by the end of the session, you will feel slightly more comfortable, or perhaps you will have a change in your mindset. And finally, we are going to argue that the tools are actually not that important when we teach online. I have been, over the last couple of days, watched a couple of webinars, read a couple of blog posts, and there is an overwhelming number of people posting and sharing and talking about the tools that we can use when we teach online. We're kind of going in a different direction. We're going to basically argue that the tools are not really that important, and that you can actually teach a pedagogically sound lesson using maybe only 2 tools, and one of them being Zoom, because that's what we use to communicate and to see each other, and the second one being Google Docs. So that's why the session is called Pedagogy Before Technology. And the aim is to actually facilitate online learning. So, Mike, let's...
Yeah, I think, Andrew, do you want to say anything
something
just briefly to welcome everyone?
Yeah, sure. Welcome again, everybody. If we saw you yesterday or over the weekend, welcome back. If it's your first time with us, a big welcome, and welcome to our community. And of course, this is what we try to create and to facilitate a community of professionals who can come together and just talk about teaching and talk about ways to do our job a different way, a better way, sometimes a worse way, or just a different way. And in times of we're all together having to teach online now, so we'll try and make the best of it. And as Leo said, tools are nice and tools can be flashy, but it's still teaching. So hopefully we don't have to make drastic changes. So welcome, and I guess let's get started. If you do have a question, throw it in the chat, and I'll get to it as well as Leo and Mike go through the presentation.
Yeah. So I guess we've already kind of provided an overview. Basically, it's what we're trying to get away from is teaching or using technology for the sake of using technology. But as Leo has already stated, and as Andrew says, that this is the reality. This is the world we live in. Technology has become ubiquitous now to our teaching situations. And but we want to show you that in spite of that we need to kind of remain true to sound pedagogy. And really that's the focus of today is to basically remember that our role is teachers first, and that again we have to use this medium now to our advantage and ensure that the students still get the same quality lessons that they would if we were delivering it face to face. So with that in mind, as we have here the aims of this lesson, by the end of this session, you should be familiar with the terminology associated with listening. And again, this is a listening webinar. And as Leo mentioned, we're going to focus on two types of technology, so Zoom and Google Docs. And again, we're focusing on the pedagogy here. So we expect, and you should expect, to be familiar with what an effective listening lesson involves. And perhaps you should have thought about why listening should be taught and not tested. And I think that as we go through this difference should become quite clear, that we are not saying that we should merely just test our students' ability to comprehend a text, but rather to provide strategies which makes them better listeners. And also, you should be able to articulate appropriate and principled listening aims and have considered the adoption of authentic listening materials. And we will talk a little bit about this. We do not subscribe to, we do not believe that textbooks and graded listening should be used in the classroom. We believe that listening situations, listening activities should be as authentic as possible. And we will talk about that throughout the workshop. And hopefully you will have a higher level of comfort in using those as well. And then finally, we always encourage people to be reflective. So we really think that by the end of this, you should be able to kind of analyze and assess your own current practice and maybe set targets for future practice. Having said that, a disclaimer would be that we are not experts in terms of teaching the tech. We are learning by doing as well. And we encourage you through the chat and through your participation in the breakout rooms to really share your own successes with us and to go. And a lot of that has to do with our actual framework. So the way that we design our curriculum and the way that we design our teacher training or professional development workshops is that really we draw on three key areas. We draw on our knowledge of second language or additional language acquisition theory. We try to make sure our practice is based also in research. And finally, we also recognize that we bring a lot of personal and practical classroom experience to our classrooms and to our professional development workshop design. So really, if you can see in that picture, where we come is where we appear is that nexus of that diagram. And really, we draw on all of this. And again, I'm sure that a lot of you have a lot of experience, and that is just as important as knowing the theory and knowing what research says about classroom practice. So we really want to blend all of those together. So with that in mind, let's get started with a warmer. So what I'd like for you to think a little bit about is, I think we're going to use breakout rooms for this, right, Leo?
Yeah.
So in the breakout rooms, I want you to just come up with a list of two things. So the first list should be a list of things you listen to in daily life. Okay, so what sort of things are you listening to when you're just going through your daily routine? What sort of things are you listening to when you're enjoying some downtime, podcasts, news, and so on? And we'd also like for you to talk a little bit about how you're listening to those. So what are the perhaps the skills that are at play, or information are you trying to focus on when you listen to those different types of texts? So Leo, do you want to throw us into some breakout rooms?
We're going to go to some breakout rooms now.
Here.
Okay. Is it working, everyone? Can you hear each other?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So it's the what. What do you listen to? What kinds of listening texts you are exposed to on a daily basis, and perhaps how you listen to those things. What kinds of skills are at play when you're listening to those things?
Okay.
So, what do you listen to?
I usually listen to podcasts. I listen to people at home, at work, and a lot of noise around.
Okay. So when you're listening to people, how do you often listen? What skills are at play when you're listening to people?
My goodness.
That's a good question, because that's a very important one. We have to think about not only about what we're listening to, but also how we're listening to things, right? We have Plamen here. You can chime in if you have anything to say, Plamen.
Yeah, sure. I think it's like when we have a reading comprehension, we can listen intensively for specific information or extensively when you read for fun. And these days with we're trying to transfer content online, so it was lots of intensive listening and TED Talks and podcasts and MP3s and how to post all those online for our students. But listening, when you first asked us that, I thought about speaking because these two are somehow interconnected.
Right.
Like you can't be a good speaker if you're not a good listener or something like that, I believe.
Right. That's true. That's true. Vitalia, you want to say something? We can't hear you.
Excuse me.
I don't know if your audio is on. I could hear Manuel and Plamen. Did I pronounce that right? Plamen?
Yes, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay. We still cannot hear you. What else? While Vitalia fixes her audio, I was thinking as well. What are the kinds of listenings that our students are often exposed to? They're basically listening to subway announcements. They're listening to, if they're traveling a lot, they're often listening to airport announcements. A lot of students who are permanent residents in Canada, they're probably listening to or having to have to listen to their kids' teachers. So there's a bunch of different skills at play in how they're listening. And a lot of the times when we really think about teaching listening, we're not really taking into account the skills that are required for the different types of listening there. Like as you said, Plamen, with extensive listening, when you're listening for pleasure versus when you're listening to a lecture, there's two different types of listening there, right?
Yes, and I'm also very happy to see that recently at both colleges I've been teaching, there's this use of authentic material instead of ESL material, which is meant for ESL learners. And we switched entirely. I'm happy to say that as material that is not meant for ESL learners, which is also important, I guess.
Are you a proponent of graded materials or authentic materials?
I believe that any material can be practically used with any level, but you have to grade a task.
Yeah.
Right. So because when they come to our classroom, I mean, we don't teach them for a particular setting or for a specific listening activity, because when they go out, they like activity control has different accents and different different speed of talking. So I believe they need to be exposed to what varieties of English. But in the classroom, of course, we can grade the task. We can scaffold their understanding.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We're gonna go back to the main room now.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. We're gonna wait for everyone to come back. Okay. Back into the main room. So very quickly, I know a lot of you have asked this in the chat, but I'm going to wait until everyone is back. But one of the beautiful things about Zoom, especially if you're not teaching one-to-one, is that you could definitely use these breakout rooms with your students. I taught a class this morning with George Brown, a college here in Canada, in Toronto specifically. And one of the things that we did was utilizing these breakout rooms extensively. Over the weekend, I also taught a group of students from Learn Your English. And it was a class of I had about 50 students from all over the world. And one of the things we did is we used these breakout rooms extensively, along with Google Docs. So we would always have one person from each group to be using the document and always typing up pretty much a short report of what the students in that specific group discussed. So that's just one example of how you can actually do a lot of pair work. And as a teacher, one of the benefits of Zoom is that you can join different breakout rooms to monitor and make sure that students are on task. Because I remember joining a class this morning, I mean, one of the breakout rooms this morning, and students were talking about what they were drinking last night. And I said, that's exactly, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not exactly what the task was. So that's just one example of how Zoom is very good for this. So Mike, do you want to?
No, I think if you just share the screen, I think that definitely my group, and these are just a few ideas that might have come to mind in other groups as well. With that, when we think of what we listen to, I actually, it's quite interesting. I don't know if any other groups, please make comments in the chat. But we spend a lot of time talking about stories. But actually, Lee, if you go to the next slide, we talked a little bit about the pedagogy around it as well. People mentioning the use of pictures and other things. And I think what we focused on was some of these. So for example, maybe just listening for general ideas. So in a story, maybe listening to what happened, but also getting the details. We also talked a little bit about pronunciation, which I think ties into the third one there, which is listening for mood and sound and changes in pitch, and trying to gather the emotion that are at play. And then again, the photos came up again. So this idea of predicting of what's coming up and paying attention to the situation, but also in terms of confronting new vocabulary, listening for what's coming before key points and after key points. So it was quite interesting. In the short time we had, we indirectly kind of covered several of these. Yeah.
And of course, one of the things I was doing this morning with my morning class, and I was teaching a very low level, I would say maybe an A2 plus, very low B1. And we were listening to a very difficult text. It was a BBC text in which students were looking at, the title was it was COVID-19 versus influenza. How do these two viruses contrast? What the differences between the two of them? And one of the things that students were able to do before we were listening was actually doing a lot of prediction. And they've noticed a change. Again, what we're trying to get to here, everyone, is that there is a way of approaching listening in which we are actually training students to become autonomous learners, because what we don't want them to do is we don't want them to always rely on the teacher to practice listening skills. So let's move along to talk about teaching, practicing, or testing listening. So this is going to be an interesting one, because with all the training that we have been doing over the past couple of years, we find that it seems to be very difficult for people to differentiate between these, especially teaching and testing. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to look at, maybe perhaps just type your answers for number one. If students listen to an audio text and answer a list of comprehension or multiple choice questions, are we teaching, are we practicing, or are we testing listening? What do you think? Well, Clement said could be all three. Okay, testing. Overwhelming majority right now are saying testing. Okay. Okay. Marina said, could it be all three? Testing and practicing. Testing, but can be an assessment for listening. Okay. We won't answer right now. We'll leave you hanging. Let's go to number two. Students listen to a text, and then they have to see if the text that they listen to matches a text that they have read. Are we teaching? Are we practicing? Or are we testing listening? So for number two, what do we have? Practicing and testing. Somebody said all three. Practicing. All three, practicing. Michael said testing and practicing. Okay. Most people are, a lot of practicing. Teaching. Okay. To those of you who say teaching to number one or teaching to number two, I think you will be surprised when we get to the bottom of the list. But let's look at number three now. Number three, students listen to a flight announcement or flight announcements to find the time of the one flight that they want. Are we teaching? Are we practicing? Or are we testing, listening here? Let's see. Testing, practicing. Some people saying all three. That's the easiest way to to answer this. Practicing. Okay.
It's not Michael, is it? Because he was hedging all over the place last night. So.
Yes. Teaching, providing an instruction. Well, if they're just listening to a bunch of different audio with different snippets with flight announcements, and and let's say they have a printed ticket, and they say their flight is flight AB 090, and they're listening to different ones. I don't know how much teaching is happening there. There's definitely practicing. There's definitely a little bit of testing there. Let's go to number 4. Let's get to number 4. Students listen to a 30-minute lecture, and then they take notes while they're listening to this. What do we have here? Patricia said it depends on what comes before the lecture or after the lecture. I'm not sure I understand that. So people are saying practicing. Could be testing if it's part of an assessment. Okay. Oh, okay. It's for the other question. Sorry. It's okay. Could be an assessment on taking point form notes. Okay. Here's a question that I have for everyone. I mean, how can we assess? And this is something that I've seen, and we've seen this, Mike, in a lot of the universities and colleges that we have worked. A lot of the times we have universities and colleges assessing students' notes, their note-taking. I think a question that I want to throw to everyone who is here today is, how would you feel if someone were to assess your note-taking? I mean, my note-taking is a mess, and I'm the only person who understands it. How can we expect our students who are listening a foreign language, who have to do a lot of decoding as they're listening, predicting, paying attention to tone, paying attention to emotions, and then they have to take notes when they struggle with spelling, they struggle with vocabulary, they struggle with grammar? How can we really, I mean, I think the question is, how fair is it for us to assess our students on their note-taking? Right?
And is it actually an authentic task as well, right?
Right. How authentic is? I mean, taking notes is authentic.
Yeah. Oh no, that's authentic. Being graded on it, right? Right. Yeah. So it's quite good. There's a lot of vulnerability coming out in the chat. That's what it's all about.
But that's what we're talking about. For us, is what Mike said. Is for us, it's all about putting ourselves in the student's shoes, authorizing the entire process of learning a language. Maria said, in the CELPIP, you have to take notes to pass the listening test successfully. Note-taking is not assessed or should not be assessed. I agree. I think students need to be able to understand. They need to be able to process, decode language. But again, how much are we teaching when we are assessing their note-taking skills? I think my argument, my contention is that we're actually not really teaching listening. We're basically just, perhaps as most of you have said, we're practicing listening, and we are also testing, because I remember a conversation Mike and I had about this. But anyway, I guess we need to define teaching and assessing. Well, teaching listening, we're going to get to that, because that's the whole point of the lesson, of the session. And question number 5, students focus on the language that lecturers use to signal important information and give examples. Then they are asked to give mini lectures using them. We have some people saying testing. Brian said testing, teaching. Brian said teaching. Mariana said all 3. Antonio said all three. Practicing and testing. Okay, practicing. A lot of practicing.
I did see a few teaching.
Yeah, there's a few teaching. Yeah. More teaching in 5. Michael said, well, Michael is on the ball, man. He's always on fire. I hope he doesn't fall asleep by minute 30 of the webinar. We believe, and this is what we think, going to the class, I mean, if we think about this, when students go to the classroom, we have to do more than practice and more than just test their listening skills. our contention is that a lot of what we're doing in the classroom, not because it's our fault, but it's because the way the materials were designed, the ways the syllabus was created, is that we end up teaching very little listening. And most of the time, what we are actually doing is we're just adding another listening text to their repertoire of practicing listening. And we're most of the time just testing their listening skills, because we're never looking back and we're never thinking about why students were not able to answer the list of comprehension questions. We're never able to identify why miscommunication, or in this case, misunderstanding, occur. So, which brings us to this. What's the point? Well, the point is very simple. It's that we have to do more than just practice, because practicing, they can do it at home. And testing, it's something that we can do. They can also do at home. I mean, but they can be tested in the classroom. But the point is, and this is something that John Field said back in 1998, before he wrote a book, Listening in the Classroom, he said that the methodology that we currently use, and this is, again, going back to the conventional listening comprehension lesson. And by conventional here, what he's basically referring to is to all the training that we went through. And by the training, I'm talking about all TESOL Canada, CELTA courses, all these TEFL courses that we have been, we have probably have gone through. And a lot of it, what we're doing is we're just giving students a list of comprehension questions. They listen to the text, they answer the questions, and then we move on to the next one. The point is, what we're basically doing is we're just adding another text to their experience. And in fact, we're doing very little, or I would argue almost nothing, to actually improve the effectiveness of their listening, and more importantly, to address the shortcomings as listeners. So this is what we call the comprehensive approach to listening, where students are given a text and they're given a list of comprehension questions, and then they just have to listen to the text. And of course, what we do is we start with pre-teaching vocab, which is something that we also don't believe in, but we will talk about that later. But we pre-teach vocab, students listen to a text, they have a list of comprehension questions, and then they have to answer. Now, a question that I'm going to throw to all of you is, how transferable is this skill to our students? When was the last time you were watching the news in your living room and you were given a list of comprehension questions when you were listening to a text? I don't think anyone has ever experienced that. So the point we're trying to make is that what we're doing in the classroom doesn't really reflect a skill that will be transferable to our students. And if we want our students to succeed outside the classroom, which is the ultimate goal of language learning, of language teaching, in our opinion, which is to facilitate learning, we need to do a little bit more than that. And that is the main argument for pedagogy before technology, for this idea of how can we teach a pedagogically sound lesson that involves listening, that involves speaking, and that involves vocab, and that involves pronunciation. So bear with us. Well, as I said, we need transferable skills. We need our students to acquire strategies that can be applied outside the classroom. So the way we've divided this workshop, this session, is we're going to look at 4 stages of a listening lesson. The first one, I think all of you are very familiar with, is this idea of preparing for listening, or if we're using second language acquisition jargon here, is what we call activating our schemata. So if I were to ask you, whenever you think about the word online teaching, what comes to mind? And you would say Zoom, Skype, I don't know, maybe people can type it up in the chat. But those are
problems.
Yeah, problems, yeah. Internet speed, things like that, okay? But we would never think about bandwidth. Yes, so you would think about, so if I said this to you, you're gonna listen to a person talking about online teaching. What kinds of expectations do you have about online teaching? What kinds of, so instead of us pre-teaching students vocab, one thing we could do is we could ask them to think about what words they expect to hear from a text like that. That is a more transferable skill than just simply teaching a list of words. Again, same argument. Do you think, how many of you believe that our students, when they go to college or when they go to university, their professors are going to give them a list of 20 words that they're going to be using in the lecture so they can learn those words before the lecture is delivered. None. So I find, and Mike believes in this too, and Andrew too, that this idea of pre-teaching vocab is detrimental to the kind of real, authentic listening they're going to be exposed to outside the classroom. Patricia said, we can anticipate what problems may be. Yes, connected speech, we'll get to that. Sal said it's a radical idea. Perhaps it's just a different way of looking at things. I wouldn't say radical. I would say perhaps more natural. And I think it's very much in line with the way languages are actually learned. When kids are learning a language, we don't pre-teach vocabulary to them. When they're watching a TV show, they're not pre-taught vocab. Yes, that's true. Sal is saying here, Mike, I don't know if you're following the chat, but he's like, beep, but it's true. It's true. Nobody talks about this. You know why? Because the entire industry, the entire ESL industry is very top down. We go to these TESOL conferences, we go to these TESOL courses, and all we are taught is you have to follow this way of teaching. And what we're saying is there is no right or wrong way. There is only experimenting. There's only testing it out. There's only trying out different things. So
yeah. And just to add to that, Leo, it's again, it's about this otherizing, right? It's not being top down. It's saying, who am I to choose the words that are important to the students, right? Part of my goal as a teacher and a material designer is to choose tasks that I know will be of interest to my students, and as you have all mentioned in the chat, to think of tasks that will kind of get them to generate and activate their existing knowledge about that. And then as they listen and as we go through these next stages, that's when we expand. But again, it's all student driven for the most part, right?
Yeah. Well, what Mike said is also true. I find that for some reason we don't give enough credit to our students. A lot of our students have, some of them have PhDs from their country. Some of them have masters. Some of them are highly educated people. And I find that in a way, it could be somewhat patronizing to be pre-teaching words that we are naturally assuming, as Mike said, we're naturally assuming that students won't know. But how do we know that they don't know that? Nancy said, how long is this webinar? It's a 5-hour webinar, Nancy. So stick around. It's going to be a little
That's a great point, Nancy. That's a great point. Thank you for calling us out on that. Yeah.
So let's get to the pre-listening. So we're not saying that there shouldn't be any vocab teaching or anything. But one thing we normally do with pre-listening, we try to get students to talk a little bit about the topic. We've chosen a TED Talk called English Mania. And we thought that the word mania kind of stood out a little bit for us. So one thing we would do is we would ask our students to look at the word mania here. And I'm going to use my drawing tools here. And we would ask our students to study the definition below, perhaps try to explain what the word mania means. Of course, we would expect our students, I don't expect my students to be able to read the IPA. If they can't pronounce, of course, as a teacher, it's your job to explain that. But what we're looking at is we're trying to think more about in terms of connotation here, right? Does this word have a positive or a negative connotation, right? Mania. And then once we look at, so we're looking at guessing meaning, not so much guessing meaning, but understanding the meaning. We're looking at the connotation. What we could do after is we could draw their attention to the collegiate. The word mania is always followed by a preposition, in this case, the preposition for. And normally you have, right? We would use the verb have. So what we would have here is we would have a focus not only on collocations, what words collocate. So if mania is a noun, then we have adjectives that we can use with mania. We can say religious mania. We could talk about football mania. And then, of course, we would also emphasize the colligations, which are basically, if you guys are not familiar with the word colligation, you would It basically means grammatical structures around a word. So the colligation would be to have a mania for. So one question here, Petrushka said, so you did pre-teach vocab. We're not really pre-teaching vocab. We're actually just getting students to really enjoy or to feel more comfortable or more connected or personalize the idea of the topic of manias. I mean, you could say, yes.
Yeah, Leo. No, I think first of all, it's a great point, and we had actually thought about that when we designed this lesson. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that it's in the title itself, and we're just thinking of our own classrooms. Again, it's all about otherizing. Mm-hmm. So if I'm a student and I don't know this word, my natural reaction is to check my dictionary.
Yeah.
And again, this is about teaching them practical skills that they can use when we're not around. So we know that they're going to probably want to go to their dictionary. So it's our job as teachers to then, okay, well, let's really think about how we would look up this word in a dictionary. We wouldn't just look it up for meaning. We would look it up for, as Leo's breaking it down now, we would look for the collocations. We would look for the nuance or the connotation that goes with that. So I agree, it's a great point. You're very observant of you to see that. But again, it's a larger context that we're dealing with, isn't it, Leo? Like,
yeah, it's not just pre-teaching vocab. It's just really looking at, as you said, the bigger picture. Michael, of course, asked a very good question. Prefixing could be seen as a form of collocation. Yes, I have seen that. We, as I said in the chat, we subscribe to Michael Lewis's view of collocations, and collocations for us will only include nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Oh, the last word doesn't look like adverbs, but anyway, let's move on. So what we would do next is we would get students to actually have a conversation with each other. Do you have any manias? What do you have a mania for? And one of the things we could do is we could highlight and expect our students to try to incorporate this lexical chunk, have a mania for. So they could say, oh, Leo, I have a mania for, I don't know, collecting stamps. Or Michael has a mania for, I don't know, Sonia has a mania for, Elaine has a mania for. And then they could actually report it to the class, and what they're doing, they're actually using this lexical chunk. So once they've done that, we could move on and then finally get to what we said earlier, the preparing your mind, activating your schema. So we've done that a little bit with the word mania, and then we're moving on to the title of the talk, which in this case is The World's English Mania. And how do we prepare our students to do this? Well, one of the things that we like to do is we like to ask, instead of giving the students a list of comprehension questions, what we want is we really want to motivate our students. We want some sort of what's his name? Ellis calls task investment. So in order for students to actually be interested in listening, we have to find a way for them to be accountable, for them to be invested in the task. And how can we do this? How can we get our students to predict what's going to be coming out in this talk? Yes,
let's Maria's, yeah, she's on it.
Yeah, so that's what we would do. We would ask them to come up with their own questions. And by asking students to come up with their own questions, we are not only increasing task investment, we're generating what Chick sent me high, don't ask me to spell his name because it's mostly 35 consonants and 2 vowels, but Chick sent me high calls flow. Students become not only invested, but they kind of get into the flow. So what they would do is we could, as teachers, say, based on the title and the description of this video, could you write a few questions that you think will be answered in the talk? Close. Plasmin got close to his, I think it's close to that. You have to Google his name. But that's what we would do. So we could do this with students working in pairs, in groups. One of the ideas that we heard last time from a teacher was maybe we could give students, each group of students would get a different WH word. So let's say group A gets why, group B gets where, group C gets when, and so on and so forth. So students would create their own questions. And that also, I would argue, oh, here we go. Csikszentmihalyi. Yes, Csikszentmihalyi. Yeah, Andrew got it. But I forget what I was saying now. Oh, yes. So once they come up with their own questions, I would argue that this is actually the kind of critical thinking that we want our students, that we talk so much in our industry. Oh, we need to teach critical thinking. We want our students to be critical thinkers. But yet, we're still providing them with a list of comprehension questions that we design based on the assumptions that we've made about the text. So if we want really critical thinking, I think we should not only take this opportunity to actually have our students come up with the questions, but also it gives us an opportunity to see how much our students can actually design or create questions based on a title. I find that this is the time when I can see that my students are really struggling with question formation. And that becomes another learning opportunity, because then you can review question formation. And I think all of you here are going to agree that question formation is a real struggle for students, especially because of the invisible do, which we will eventually talk about one day. So what we would do next, so students have come up with, I'm going to show you the questions that my students came up with. And like I said, I'm talking about an A2 plus, perhaps B1, very low B1 class. This is what they came up with. The first question, what is the English mania? Another group said, why does the world have an English mania? When did the English mania start? Who created this? This question number 5, you might think, well, your students didn't write that. Well, they didn't, but that's your job as a teacher, is as they are trying to say what they're trying to say, your job is to try to scaffold, to reformulate their questions into questions that are actually better written or grammatically accurate. Is the English mania good or bad? Of course, there's a yes. So I try to, somebody asked this on the session on Friday, Leo, should my students focus on yes or no questions? It's really up to you. I would say I want my students to practice WH questions, because yes or no questions are slightly less complex than WH questions, because there's not a lot of inversion and there's not the addition of an auxiliary verb in that sense. Advantages and disadvantages of English mania. And then one student said, how can we escape the English mania, Leo? Somebody asked me, Leo, do you include all the questions? Yes, even the bad ones, because at the end, I want to make sure that students know why that question was a bad question. So we can always come back to that and say, why do you think these questions were not answered? Well, because, and then we can hypothesize, we can do different things with that. Now, my question to all of you is this. Students have come up with the questions. You have corrected them. You use this as a learning opportunity. What would you do next? You have the questions. What's the next step? Do you play the video? Do you have them listen and answer these questions? What would you do as a teacher? Isabel is asking, they make up before watching the video or the listening? Well, yeah, before. Oh, Sal said something interesting. They predict the answers. Yes, Sal, that's a good one. Fabiana said they try to guess. Yes. I would ask them to answer the questions before. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Helen said pair work. I like that. I like that. I would play the video, then have them try to answer their questions. Yes, you can do the video too. I'm not saying that it's wrong. It's just, for us, it's how much can we milk this for language. We want language. We teach language. We don't teach content. Remember this. We're not teaching content. You are not content experts. We are language experts. Okay? So I'll say one thing that I heard recently from one teacher who was in our session on Friday. I don't know if he's here today, Lorenzo. Lorenzo said, have the students have conversations about these in which they actually come up with their own answers to these questions. I thought that was a pretty good suggestion. I'll show you what I did with my students, because again, for me, it's all about thinking. So once my students came up with the list of comprehension questions, I asked them to do this. I asked them to think about the focus. So we talked a lot about testing. Students who take IELTS tests, students who take CPE tests or Cambridge exam tests or different types of tests, they could think about the focus of each question. By thinking about the focus, they are able to predict the kind of question, the kind of answer that each question requires. So for instance, with question number 1, what is the English mania? Students said, oh, Leo, the focus is on the topic, the meaning. I said, okay. Question number 2, why does the world have an English mania? Reason. I said, okay. And then a follow-up to this could be, what kind of words would help you get to that answer? So they would say, oh, he was probably going to say, people are learning, people have an English mania because, right? So we would get to that. When did the English mania start? Again, students were able to say, oh, Leo, we're listening for time. We're listening for a date. Good. Who created the English mania? Oh, Leo, we're listening for a name. So that's why in the beginning of our session, we asked you, what kinds of texts do you listen to and how do you listen to? When we are on the subway, we're not listening to every single announcement. We only take off our headphones when they say, attention passengers, we're experiencing a delay. And then when we hear the word delay, we already know, because we are Torontonians and we know that TTC is always late. So we kind of just go back to our regular podcast. So that's another thing you can do. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it, but you can always, like I said, we like to go back to this idea of really exploiting the material, not adding another listening text to their repertoire, to their experience, really getting them to understand, to focus, to design questions, to think critically. And then once they think critically about the questions, they can think about what types of questions those questions are and what types of answers those questions are going to elicit. Okay?
Leo, can I just jump in before we move
Sure.
into the next topic? I think that came up in the chat was dealing with mixed level classes and how do you know that your activities and that your text, if we are using authentic materials, are effective. And I just wanted to get your take on it, because I think for us, when we're using something like this TED Talk, we're really saying, okay, so we're looking for investment. And that's a really key word that Leo mentioned. And therefore, when we're choosing our text, we have to think about the text that would cause or generate the most investment. And the only way we can do that is by getting to know our students and working on that rapport and tapping into their psychology right away to find out where they are. And the second thing I would say about that is to, as Leo said, can always do this perpetual needs analysis, right? So questions are a good example of something that students at most levels struggle with. So let's find different points in our classes and in our various activities to kind of keep this ongoing needs analysis, so that we can then create a map of our classroom and say, okay, so I know that my class consists of these weaker students, but I also know it consists of these stronger ones. So when I do this pre-listening task, I'm going to have them, as Lorenzo said, I'm going to have them working in a mixed group, right? Or I'm going to account for this differentiation, right? Use differentiation to kind of target these groups. And I think it's a real good thread that came up, and I just wanted to touch on it. So it's not lost as we go forward.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Just jump in here for a sec. Sal asks how we can incorporate grammar, and I'll just say, hang on, Sal.
Yes.
We're coming there. Hang on.
We're still teaching.
It's a 5-hour workshop, Sal. So I just
got 4.5 hours to go here, so just hang on.
But I think it's a valid question, because we're constantly thinking about, like, when do we teach grammar? When do we teach grammar? When do we teach grammar? You just taught grammar during the question formation part of the lesson here. That's the teaching part right there. You are actually doing some teaching here, because if you see here, some of the questions are focusing on simple present and simple past, which, again, 90% of spoken English is only two tenses, simple past and simple present. The other 5% are the continuous tenses, and the other 3% are all the perfect tenses. My question to all of you is, why are we still teaching so much grammar when we only use two tenses when we communicate in spoken English? So again, but there is the grammar aspect right here. Even when you were doing the speaking part at the beginning, when they were talking about mania, right? That's an opportunity for you, because many students will say, I have a mania about, I have mania football, instead of saying I have a football mania or I have a mania for football. So there is always opportunities within a lesson for you to actually focus on, and this is very important, reactive teaching of grammar, not preemptively teaching of grammar. I think grammar should be taught, and we all agree on this, Mike, Andrew, and I, and this is what all the entire research on second language acquisition has been suggesting over the last couple of years, is that grammar should not be taught preemptively. Here's the grammar, use it. No, here's the task, speak. As you are struggling, my job is to fill in the gaps, is to react to how you're struggling with the language. So that's something to bear in mind. Grammar should always be taught reactively. We are not against teaching grammar. We only believe that grammar should be taught when we notice those shortcomings in students' spoken communication. I hope this makes sense. Let's move on. I got a bit too carried away here. Before I move on, one thing I could say is you could actually design a grid for your students on Google Doc. This is an example of the one that I created for my students. So they would write the questions here. And then, of course, I designed this where they basically, their first task when they listen to the task is actually very easy. And this is something that, who was in my group earlier today? I think it was Plamen. Plamen said this. We don't grade the text. We grade the task, right? The World English Mania is an authentic TED Talk with an authentic speaker. But what we want to do, especially if we're teaching lower levels, is we want to make the task easy for the students. And how can we do this? Very simple. They've already designed their own questions. So they are already invested in listening to that. So they will feel more motivated to actually focus, listen, and then the task is very simple. How many of your questions were answered? So that would be the first listening task. So they would say, oh, question number 1. Yeah, he didn't answer that one, Leo. Question number 2. Oh, he did. Oh, question number 3, he didn't. And then, of course, there will be moments where you'll be like, are you sure he didn't answer number 4? Maybe we should play it again. And that already gives you, and this is the important thing, that already gives you what Mike said earlier. It gives you a chance to diagnose the kinds of listening problems students are having. So this listening, these questions give you a chance to identify, oh, students are having a lot of problems with why questions. That tells you that they're not able to decode certain words for giving reasons. So in a way, this kind of approach already gives you a chance to find out the kinds of problems that your students are having with listening. Whereas a comprehension approach, the one that we are taught in our CELTA, in our TESOL Canada, in our TESOL Ontario, in all these other TESOL courses that are very top-down, is here's a list of comprehension questions. Okay, oh, you got number 1 correct, number 2 is wrong, number 3 is right. Okay, good. All right, let's move on to the speaking now. How much teaching happened in a lesson like that? I would argue that there is very little, almost nothing there, okay? So let's move on. So students listen. Oh, sorry. I wouldn't play the listening yet. So this is the other thing I would say. There is something that it's recent in second language acquisition, which is something that we call ear training, or the theory of accommodation. So I'll try to explain this very simply. I have a good friend from Spain who comes to Toronto every other year, and he has a CPE. He's a very fluent speaker of the language. But the moment he came to Toronto and he met a friend that I have from Pakistan, and I understand my friend from Pakistan very well, but the moment my Spanish friend and my Pakistani friend met, my Spanish friend could not understand the guy in the beginning. So the first maybe 3 minutes of their conversation, he kept looking at me and saying, Leo, I don't know what he's saying. Can you? It is funny because I could. So what this is, guys, it's basically what we call accommodation. So every speaker, if you're first L1 or L2, the listener always accommodates to the speaker by doing something that is also called alignment. And how do we align? We align phonologically. We are echoing the speaker's words or their grammatical patterns. In other words, the language processed by the listener as a receiver plays an important part in the way in which the listener as a respondent constructs her next utterance. So Plowman said, fine-tuning the ears. Exactly. Normally what we do is we throw students into the deep end. It's okay, you're going to listen to a 30-minute talk with this guy from Australia. Good day, mate. He's going to listen to this Australian guy. Okay, go. And our students have never been exposed to an Australian accent. What do you think is going to happen after the first 30 seconds? Most students just give up. They give up. You can see the look of disappointment in their faces. You can see how they're like, you know what? I don't think I can do this. And there goes our entire listening. And Vitalia said, don't let accents throw you off. Absolutely. We're not saying that, but we need to give our students a chance to, as Plowman said, I think I love this. I'm actually going to write this down here. Giving a chance to fine-tuning the ears. I love that. I'm going to borrow that. I hope you don't mind, Plowman. Fine-tuning the ears. Yes. Michael Birch said, finding the neutral point of the accent. Man, I love that. Like a gearbox. Yeah. Angelica said, aren't they doing it in the very beginning to IELTS, letting the students listen to a small part of that? To a certain extent. Mike, you've done a lot of work with IELTS. Maybe you can address this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't invigilate the listening, but I think that's the people at Cambridge aren't stupid, right? They would have. No, I mean, they consider this. They have extensive experience with testing, they don't explicitly call it this in the test notes, but of course there's this idea of introducing the way the instructions are paced, the way that they're done in this manner that are short and succinct, with speakers who all sound very similar. And it's again just to align the listener or test taker to the accent.
Nancy said, no, they're not. They're just making sure everyone can hear. I agree. I think it's just a test. Can everyone hear? And then they play something for 30 seconds. I don't know if a lot of that is fine tuning, but I also tell my students, I think that's a very important strategy. Listen to the first 30 seconds of whatever you're listening to, maybe 2 or 3 times, so you become accustomed. You're more used to that accent. You're fine tuning, or as Michael said, you're finding the neutrality in the accent. So my question to all of you would be, how can we do this? How can we actually design a task that would get students to actually fine tune? Maybe people didn't hear my question. What would be a task for you here? Sorry, maybe I didn't make my question very clear. What would be a task for you to get students to fine tune, for them to have this ear training, this accommodation, or find the neutrality? I love this. I learned so. Thanks everyone. I'm learning so much from you. All the ideas. We learned these new terms. Sorry, Leo, I heard it. I'm just really thinking. Okay. Yeah, no, this is what we want. We want people to think. We're not here to tell you how to do things. Phonology depends on contrast. So distinguish, for example. Yes. Michael, I'm going to be interviewing a researcher. Her name is Mariah Michel, and she's been doing a lot of research on alignment, phonological alignment, lexical alignment and grammatical alignment. And basically her argument is that we are naturally aligning, but what she's trying to understand is if we are consciously or subconsciously aligning. Again, looking at second language learners. Vitalis said, put them in a situation where they're forced to fine-tune, like a tourist in a foreign country. Yes, but how about in this task? How would we do this? You can play the recording for a minute, get them to guess. Aha, yeah. I like what Plowman said. Get them to listen to the first minute, guess who the speakers are, where they are, why they're discussing this topic. Yeah, I like that. There's someone called Ardit. I'm actually going to write down this name. Michael said this person's Arditi Lariri, professor in Oxford. Okay, we'll check it out. Michael, you should get in touch with us. We probably want to talk to you eventually. I sometimes ask them to close their eyes and imagine they can see the speakers. Okay. Oh, linguistics.
I like that one. I like that one a lot, actually.
Yeah, so this idea of visualizing, right? Closing your eyes and just listening with your inner ears. It's very it's kabbalistic, I would say, to a certain extent. Okay, this is what we decided to do. We would ask students to listen to the first 30 seconds of the talk. We could repeat this a couple of times, but again, we're looking at critical thinking, inferencing skills, right? What can the students infer about the speaker's nationality, their age, perhaps their background? Can they guess where the person is from, their accent, quality of voice? Does this person have a very, high pitch, low pitch? And Michael included this last one here, which I've never thought about this, but this is something that we discussed because we learn from each other all the time. Mike, do you want to talk about the last point?
No, I just thought that it might be thinking of the position, right? So position in terms of the context, are they an expert, insider, or outsider within the specific context, right? Mm-hmm. I also kind of thought a little bit about subcultures, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were listening to a group and then maybe it's a snowboarder talking to another snowboarder, you have these different kind of subculture things that might come out as well. So more about positionality than anything else. Yeah. I wasn't sure how to word it though.
Carla said something interesting. You don't have to worry about getting the answers right. Absolutely.
Right. Absolutely. It's just about preparing them.
Yeah. Petruska said, if it's a TED Talk, one would assume it's an expert. You would be surprised to see how many non-experts are on TED Talks. Michael says this might affect tone as well as quality. Yeah. I don't know if everyone that is doing a TED Talk is an expert. They might have, studied, they have had an experience with a certain topic or a certain theme, and then they decided to talk about their experience with that. But anyway, so that's what we would do. Students would listen to these 30-second, maybe I've done this when I did this lesson with my low-level class. They asked to listen to it 3 times, and then of course they were able to predict nationality, age, background, accent, quality of voice, whether this person is an expert or non-expert. Interestingly, one of my students who was a Chinese speaker said he is a non-expert, and I said, how do you know that? And he said, because he pronounced a Chinese word in an American pronunciation. So that's how he knew, which goes to show that our students actually are able to, we don't give them enough credit sometimes. So let's move on. So what we would do, so after students listen to the first 30 seconds, then, only then, we actually get them to listen. So we can give them the chart. Here are your questions. The first time you listen, just make sure that these questions were answered or not. Then, second time, if they were able to do this, we can check how many were right or wrong, and then we can think about, and that's when I said the diagnostic. Let's say students had a hard time with number 4 and number 5. Then we can play that extract again. So what we like to think about, what we like to look at listening from listening is not so much to be testing. Listening is supposed to be teaching them. Like if you got number 4 and number 5 wrong, why did you get them wrong? Was there a word that threw you off? Was there a sound that maybe got you confused? Well, our job is to diagnose the problem. That's what teaching listening is. It's more than just getting them to practice. It's actually getting them to think about those problems occurred. And if you want to learn more about listening, eventually we're going to be doing more sessions on how to actually design listening tasks that actually teach listening rather than test listening. Okay, so they listen the first time, they listen the second time, they take notes, they talk about it, they compare their notes with their partners, and then we do next. What do we do next? We do what we call listening for, excuse me, we do what we call listening for context, or listening for details, right? So one of the things I like to do, oh, Fabiana said, do you stop the video when you find a difficult answer? Let me go back here. That's a good question. That's why these webinars last 5 hours, because we're trying to interact with you people. We're not just here to tell you how to do it.
Leo, I can think of one because I've observed your classes before. I think of question 6, for example. Is English mania rather good or bad? I can think of a couple where the opinion might be given as an idiom, right? It's a double-edged sword, and that's like an example where I've seen Leo actually pause it, go back, and then, which it leads into the next activity actually. But it's a great point, and I think that would be a kind of clear-cut example where you would want to slow it down, because an opinion's given there, but it's not given with a signpost that we would typically. So the co-text is something that the students aren't used to, for example.
Just to add to what Michael just said, Fabiana, something that we could also do is, if the answer is between, let's say, minute 1.5 and 1.10, and that is the answer to question number 6, what you might want to do is just play 1.5 to 1.10 a couple of times. Play that 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, 10 times. And then students are like, oh, I know why I couldn't understand that. It's because if they're able to hypothesize as to why they weren't able to understand, the likelihood of them applying this, because you've made the invisible visible now. So they might be able to apply this. And again, this is what the research is suggesting, is that students might actually be able to apply this the next time they have a problem or they encounter some sort of listening issue.
Can I just jump in, because Fabiana, or are you going to jump in, Andrew? No, just Fabiana said that she does that, but she's not sure if it's the right thing to do. And that's,
Fabiana,
again, this goes back to how it goes back to how we were trained, right? Like we're trained to play it once for gist, twice for, right?
And go.
3 times for the sake of killing 20 minutes, I guess, right? So you're right. This is where you have to rationalize it. Like, what's the goal here? Is the goal here to trick the students, or is the goal here to actually help them find the answer and facilitate that curiosity, right? Because they're invested. They came up with the questions. Of course they want to find the answers to the questions.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that's a good example, I think, of teaching listening, not testing it. So if we can go back, and if it's just a 10-second extract, we can get them to transcribe it. We can get them to assess their listening. And as you said, Leo, ask them to reflect on, why didn't I hear that? Why didn't I get that answer? And then there's going to be other things in there. Maybe there's some connected speech. Maybe there's some other things that they can analyze about their own listening skills to apply it for next time, to try to address that issue. Idiomatic expressions might be difficult, but if it's not that, it could be addressed.
Michael said students want zero uncertainty. That's true. That's very true.
But Canadians love it. Drives my partner crazy. Maybe. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Oh,
I'll let you know.
Yeah. Sorry, folks. Yeah.
So, okay. So moving on. Okay. So listening for context, co-text, and detail. So what I do here is, and this is the part where you might want to prepare something. What I would do is, if you've listened to the text beforehand, what you might want to do is you might want to select some words or choose some chunks, some parts of the text that you want your students to focus on. So Maria, I'm going to answer that question in a second. So what I did here is I decided to create the topic and their notes. So this is how I think about note taking. I chose the word 2 billion. I chose the word opportunity. I chose the word gaokao, and I chose the word conversation. What I'm expecting my students to do is, what did the speaker say about these? So when they think about 2 billion, they have to think about predicting, because normally 2 billion would probably come from a question. How many people are learning English around the world? 2 billion people. So what they're listening for, they're not just listening for note-taking, they're listening for the words that come before that might help them inform what the next word is going to be. But they also have to think about this. 2 billion what? What comes after 2 billion? So they're listening for details because they have to hear the word 2 billion, but they also have to think about what's going to come before 2 billion, and then they have to think about what about 2 billion, right? Same thing with the word opportunity. The moment they're listening, blah, blah, blah. Oh, but English can give you better opportunities. Okay, opportunities for what? Opportunities for a better life, opportunities for a better job. Darlene asked, what level of English is this created for? I use this for A2, which would be like a pre-intermediate class. Gaokao, you can keep the word simple. You know your students better than I do. These are my students. I pick words that I think they won't have very many problems with, but I would still like to keep it challenging. But that's the whole point. They have to predict, they have to listen for details, they have to think about the context, and they have to take notes. So you're kind of looking at all these sub-skills involved in one listening text. Teaching beginner. Oh, beginner is a different beast. We can get to that. Beginner is a different story. But that's what we would do with this. And which brings me to what I just said earlier, this idea of trying to decode, because a lot of listening, I think this is something that Parman said when we were having a conversation in our breakout room, is this idea of intensive listening. So they've listened for gist, they were trying to listen for their predictions, then they listened for the details of the questions, and then they listened for co-text or the context or those words, and then only then we jump into decoding. So when we are listening, either in our first language or in our second language, we often engage in two types of listening behavior, and I'm going to write them here. The first one, decoding, and the second one is what we call meaning building. So we're doing those two things as we are listening. Decoding is primarily concerned with the signal reaching the ear, and that signal often comes in the form of acoustic cues that have to be translated first into the sounds. So at, cat. Oh, cat. Oh, I get it. And then into words and phrases in the listener's vocabulary. Then they're transformed into an abstract idea. In other words, what they're doing is they're changing information from one form into another. Whereas meaning building has more to do with accessing external information to bear on what has been heard. And this is basically achieved how? By drawing on our prior knowledge, our knowledge of the world, recalling what has been said up to this moment in the conversation. And it also, I would argue, encompasses decision-making. And this is important because students are constantly, we are constantly making decisions in terms of what is important, what is relevant to what has been said. And unfortunately, we are not training our students to make those decisions. And I'll give you a very good example of that. When you ask your students to take notes, you will see that they write everything down. Why? Because they're not able to make decisions in terms of importance and relevance to what has been said.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can think of an example off the top of my head. A fantastic student, excellent listener, and we were doing a similar kind of type of note-taking activity, Leo. And I think what you're getting at is the speaker said something about two of us disagree, And he was saying, I know that they disagree, but I don't know who disagrees, because he was trying to relate two of us to an actual one thing. What's a two of us? So he was right. So two of us disagree, right? So he's like, what is that? So again, he's decoding, and he's not hearing where one word begins and ends, or joins, and he's trying to relate that two of us to something he knows about in his in his world or external. And it's interesting because when I write it down on the whiteboard, he's like, oh. Really? That's what. Really?
And I think that's a very important point, Mike. Isabella said I didn't quite understand the meaning building, so I'm gonna repeat that. I'll say it again. Decoding is, again, it's basically the sound coming into your ears. Basically, cat. Oh, cat. Oh, I get it. That's decoding, right? And as Michael said, sometimes decoding can be difficult, not because they don't know the words, but because the words get crunched. And we all know English is not a stressed times language. It's more about, it's not a syllable time language, it's stress time, as opposed to Portuguese, where you say banana, or in Spanish you would say buenos dias. And in English we don't say good morning, we say good morning, good morning. That dia almost disappears sometimes, right? So with meaning building, students have to access their knowledge of the world. They have to access their knowledge about the topic in this case. If they don't know any, I'll give you an example of meaning building. If I were to listen to a TED Talk on the topic of fracking, I have no knowledge of fracking.
You don't know what the frack they're talking about.
I don't, yes, a good one. Good one. That's it. I wouldn't know because I don't have any. Just like if I have a conversation with my mechanic and he starts talking to me about parts of the car, or he starts using all that lingo that mechanics use, I will have, even though I still understand, I'm able to decode, I'm still not able to create or to have or to build meaning from those words. So we're doing both. So sometimes what happens is in a listening lesson is that sometimes students have problems with decoding, sometimes they have problems with meaning building, and sometimes they have problems with both. So that seems to be the problem. There's going to be an example of meaning building in a second, but we'll get there. And decoding and meaning building, they give rise to two different types of difficulty. Decoding, again, as Michael said, it comes from this lack of familiarity with spoken language, a gap in our vocabulary, a gap in our grammar, a deficiency in our listening skills. We hear a word or a pattern that is not recognized due to natural flow of speech. I'll give you an example of this. When I don't know if you guys are familiar with Woody Allen, he said there's a very famous stand-up show where he says, I shot a moose once. I shot a moose once. I shot a moose once. And my students were like, Leo, I shot a, what is a shota? Leo, what does shota mean? I was like, what? Leo, shota, what does shota mean? I was like, no, listen again. I shot a moose once with that New Yorker accent. I shot a moose once. Basically what he was saying is, I shot a moose once. But when he's pronouncing that, students cannot decode that. They know the words I, they know the word shoot, they know what a moose is, and they know the word once, but they cannot decode. They cannot break it down. As Mike said, the boundaries of the words become almost invisible. I shot a. So it becomes more or less like I shot a moose once. Moose, and then there's a w sound here, right? I shot a moose once. I shot a moose once. So they process that as one word. Leo, what does shot a musa? What does shot a musa once means? I was like, that's not a word. So that's what decoding is. So that's the kind of difficulty that students might have. With meaning building, on the other hand, it relates to how efficiently the learner deals with the information that he or she has extracted from the text. So they extracted something, they say, I think I know how this connects to this topic. So the meaning building is very clear in our first language. We can build meaning in our first language. Unfortunately, we assume that meaning building is transferable in a second language, when the fact of the matter is it ain't. Okay? Any comments there? Anything? The chat is blowing up. I can't keep up with the chat. I try to keep up with the chat.
It's all good. Andrew's on it. Andrew's on it. Yeah.
There's a good question from Roberta about our opinions about TED Talks in general. And I basically said they have a role, but they're basically speeches and represent, what do you say, Leo? They're transactional listening, not interactional listening.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, if our students are going to be doing presentation skills, I think TED Talks are valid. If our students want to become experts in a subject matter, or if they want to become more invested or learn more about a specific area, if they're business people, they might want to watch business TED Talks. If they're doctors, they might want to listen to medical or TED Talks related to medicine. But I think what most students want, they want interaction. They want to learn the art of conversation. And the best way, I think the best kind of listening for conversations, Andrea and I, we agree on this, and Michael too, podcasts, two people interacting, interviews. I think those are the best, because there's a lot of turn taking, there's a lot of holding the floor, there's a lot of asking follow-up questions, right?
And usually it's unscripted.
And it's unscripted. TED Talks, they're reading a script, so it doesn't really reflect the intricacies and the complexity of spoken English, full of false starts, right? Okay.
I just put a link as Leo goes there, because I know we want to get to go. Someone's sorting their laundry. I think that's hilarious. But they're still listening, which is awesome.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
But I just put a link there. So I know some people are in Canada or are teaching in a Canadian context. So there's a link there, a very short podcast from the CBC that you might want to use instead of, say, a TED Talk, which again are subject specific, but there's that bi-directional interaction. Yeah.
Okay. Moving on. So what would be a good task for students to do in terms of decoding? Perhaps we can ask people to interact a little bit. I need to take a break too. What would you ask your students to do to practice this idea of intensive listening? How can we get our students to do some sort of decoding and meaning building in the classroom?
If anyone knows Lorenzo, they can text him, because he had a great idea. But
yes.
But I'm sure everyone else does as well.
Tongue twisters, yes. They can listen to a tongue twister and they can try to transcribe that. Michael said nuclear stress kind of joins decoding to meaning. Yes, very true. It's not 5 hours long, Vitalia, and we're almost done. I was joking. Maria said, place a small chunk and let students write down exactly and then compare. Yes. Isabel said meaning building would be done as a discussion about it in class. Not necessarily, because we want them to build meaning as they're listening, Isabel. We want them to build meaning. So I think you're going to maybe we'll understand what I mean by meaning building as soon as we get to the activity. Plamen said, how about giving them the script and they fill in missing chunks? That's a possibility. Yeah. Yeah. I would move away, Plamen, from gapping one word, because if you're gapping one word, then you're not really getting them to practice the intricacies and the complexities of spoken English. You would gap maybe like 3 words, like I shot a moose. You would keep the word moose and you would delete, or you would keep the word once. I don't know, something like that. Could be collocations. But I would suggest going through the script and finding instances of where speech becomes a little blurry, where there's what's the word again, Andrew? The blur gap? Was that the word?
Oh, yeah. The blur gap. Richard Caldwell calls it the blur gap.
Yeah, so if you guys want to do more research, Andrew's going to type it up there. Richard Caldwell calls this the blur gap.
Even for us.
Even for us, yeah. Yeah. Oh, he played this audio.
Yeah.
Well, if you listen to our podcast,
Randy Newman. Didn't he have a Randy Newman clip? And he talked, couldn't figure it out either. So
even native speakers couldn't figure out. Yes, Michael Birch is on the ball, man. Jungle Talk, that's it.
There it is.
Yeah.
That's
I remember what he said, everyone. He said that most listening from textbooks is what we call, it's called garden listening. Or no, not garden. What is it called?
no. There's three stages.
3 stages.
The garden, the
Greenhouse.
It's in the
Jennifer,
chat. It's in the
yes.
chat. Yeah.
Okay.
Jennifer
Greenhouse,
Chow's
garden,
on it.
and
Yeah.
jungle. Yes, I love that. So textbooks are greenhouse because it's like, hello, Michael, how was your weekend? It was very good, thanks. And you? And the garden is just kind of moving a little bit away from that. And the jungle is um, live English outside of
Real life. Yeah.
real life. Yeah, so let's move on here. This is what I decided to do with my class. I asked them, actually, I didn't ask them, I chose. But if you're asking students to do this for some sort of learning opportunities for the household, you could ask them to choose. But it's a jungle out there, yes. You would choose a 30-second extract from the talk, and then they have to transcribe it word for word. Then, of course, with the help of the interactive transcript, which again is free on the TED website, they can compare. So they look at what they transcribed, they look at the TED Talk, and then, and this is the beauty of this, because again, we're looking at diagnosing problems in their listening. They highlight some of the words that they missed, or some of the words that they were not able to understand and they got it wrong. And then we get them to hypothesize, we get them to explain why they think they got those words wrong, or why they think they missed them altogether. So we're asking them to do a lot of things here. They listen, decode, transcribe, compare, and then they say, oh yeah, I know. So they could say, I remember one of my students said, Leo, I know this word, but when the speaker when the speaker was using this word, the sound of the word was different. So that's what I want my students to think about. And that is one of the reasons why I don't like teaching or pre-teaching vocab, because that word that you're pre-teaching before the listening, when that word is in the jungle, it's going to sound completely different. A good website for this would be Youglish. Youglish has, you can type in the word and you can hear that word being used by different speakers in different contexts. Mike already added this to the, did they hear another word that can make it memorable? Mondegreen. I actually, Michael, I start my listening lessons with my students with mondegreens. I'm actually going to end our session today with a mondegreen. Play Phrase Me is also very good. I agree. I like both. I like Youglish and Play Phrase Me. Yes, so this is what I ask my students to do. I'm going to show you an example now. So here they have their transcription. They write the time, let's say from minute 1 to minute 1:40, and then they transcribe. And then they can copy and paste the original, and then they compare. And then here they can give you a list of the kinds of mistakes, the sounds that they had problems with. I usually tell my students to find at least 2. Plamen asked a very good question. I'm curious if you asked them to do the same kind of activities for a formal test. Plamen, I'm going to be very honest with you. I'm going to find out this week, because I'm teaching a class at a college in Toronto that starts with the letters G and it has a B and a C at the end. And I'm going to ask them to I'm going to design the test that way. They come up with their own questions. They do all of this. And I taught a lesson this morning using the same kind of framework, and it was great. But yeah, I think we should. Why not? I think the question is, why not? Why should we? Right? So we've done this. So they listen to the 30. Oh, I forgot to show you the 30-second extract. We're going to get there. So this is the extract that my students decoded. Okay? But I'll get there. So we've done a lot of things so far. And then a lot of people have asked me, like, Leo, when do you focus on vocab? When do you focus on the vocab? Simply, we just focus on the vocab at the end. So they've chosen to I mean, you could ask your students to transcribe the same passage. Lorenzo said in one of our previous sessions that students can transcribe different passages different extracts, and then they could record those things on their phones, and then they can try to decode what their friends were saying, but we'll get there. So how do we focus on pronunciation? I don't believe in explicit teaching of pronunciation, and we don't believe in that as a company. We don't think that we should be reinforcing native speakerism per se. So what we do is we try to approach pronunciation from a transferable point of view. So what we could do is we could ask our students to do 3 things when they listen to that specific extract. Again, we're talking about a specific extract here. So one thing they could do, the first thing they could do is focus on thought groups, and I'm going to show you what that is. So here's an example of thought groups. So students transcribed this entire text, and then what I would do is I would play that specific extract, and then I would ask them to mark all the thought groups here. So they would say, so is English mania good or bad? Is English a tsunami washing away other languages? Pause. Not likely. So they're marking the thought group. So they're able to chunk language. Okay. Michael said, transcription is tricky and time consuming, even for C1+. I agree. How about correcting a faulty transcript? We've done that too, Michael. Andrew and I designed an activity once where we changed some of the words and they had to listen and try to correct. So for example, so is English, like for example, I did one with a Beatles song. It was like this: hey Jew, don't make it sad. Take a bad song and I don't know, and chew it better.
Make it butter. I don't know.
Make it butter. Yeah, make it butter. Okay. And make it butter. And make some butter. Okay, so you could do that too. That's a very good idea, Michael. We've done that too. It's a lot more work. It's a lot more prep, because then you have to design. We're all for little prep, little tech, milking the material for what it's worth it. So they mark the thought groups. Why is this important? Well, we're teaching our students to chunk. We're teaching chunking, right? Thought groups. A lot of the times our students, when they're listening, what they're doing is they're processing word for word. So is English mania good or bad? Is English a tsunami washing away other? What we're doing is by chunking, we're asking our students to actually think about how we divide language. When we're speaking, we have certain places in which we pause. So that's what we're doing. So that's the first thing you do. The second thing you can do is, again, I don't like teaching stress. I actually like to have our students notice stress. And how can we do this? Very simple. You just ask them to bold or underline the stress words in each thought group. In this thought group, we have English mania good. Thought group here is bad. English is tsunami. So we know that this has only a temple of 2, right? Is English a tsunami? Is English a tsunami? Washing away other languages, washing away other languages. So once they've marked the stress for the entire script, we get to the last point, which is, and again, this is a suggestion, connected speech. I don't believe in expecting my students to sound a certain way. So for me, connected speech is not for production purposes. Connected speech is for receptive, that is decoding purposes, is to actually help them with decoding language, not so much for production. Although I have heard teachers saying that they want to teach their students pronunciation, that they want their students to sound better. To me, it's all about comfortable intelligibility. And I think that's something that we should be striving for. Okay? So thought groups, stress words, connected speech. So here they would say, oh, so is English, so is English. Oh, so this all connects. How do you scaffold these 3 activities? I just did. First one, they write the transcript, right? They transcribe everything. The first time they just mark the pauses. The second time they mark the stress. And then the third time they can think about which words link together. And this is an example of that, right? So is English mania good or bad? Is English a tsunami? So there is some connected speech here. Washing away. Of course, it's very easy to just teach your students that every ending consonant and initial vowel will link together. That's a possibility. But that's it. Once you do connected speech, my question to you would be, what would you do next? Michael said a bit like a third stage in the dictogloss. Yeah. Maria said speaking. Okay. What else? Any other ideas? We're coming to an end, just so Vitalia knows that we're almost done. Writing could be. Clement said some kind of extension. I would still like to focus on pronunciation, if that's a hint. So that's the idea that we had, is our students have this one thing here that we hate so much, right? They have phones. What we could ask them to do is, why not do this while they're listening? Because they can't process all those things at the same time, Sal. Imagine you're listening for context, cotext, prediction, decoding, meaning building, and then you still want them to do this. It's a bit too much. This is why we like to focus, like, basically, that's an entire week of work. Yes, rushing to the productive stage, in my brace through the stages too swift. I agree, and I don't know if you agree with me, Plamen, and everyone else, but I find that we always rush through our lessons, and then we always have to find those 10, 15 minutes at the end to kill time. I find that I never have time to kill in my lessons. I always run out of time. Yeah, but I find that the rushing is not so much from the teachers, it's actually from the, I'm going to write this word here. It comes from the silly bus, right? We hop on the silly bus, and it's what Andrew and I like to call horse track English, right? Michael said listening is not one. Oh, it's you. It can be used over a series of lessons. Yes. Yes.
We're going to get Michael's confused again. That's what happens.
There's too many Michaels here.
I just like that. Oh, it's you. All right. Then, yeah. Leo, we have about 15 minutes.
Okay, let's go. So post-listening would be as a lot. Oh, so I forgot to say this. We would ask our students to record using their phones. They can actually record the extract with the thought groups, the pauses, with the stress, and with the connected speech. And then they record themselves, and then they can compare to the original. Again, if their focus is on improving, is on sounding better. So I'm going to rush through this last part here because we have to get going. So you could do a personalization. Something you can do is you can ask students, you can give them the script and ask students to write questions based on the words that they don't know. So you can pick that's when you do some sort of teaching. You look at words that you students, again, meaning building comes from here, right? This idea of trying to think about which words are important for the students, which words are relevant to this talk, which words are actually important for them to learn. One thing I forgot to say, and I have to go back here very quickly, because this is what, as a question here. I think it was Roberta, I don't remember who said this, but here's an example of meaning building. One of my students, when he was transcribing this part, he said, "Your native language is your wife." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said wife, Leo. I said, okay, so what we have here is not a problem so much of decoding, but mostly of meaning building, right? Does the word wife make any sense in this context? And he said, no. I said, what word sounds more close in terms of meaning, in terms of context here? And he said, life. I said, that's it. So that would be it. So moving on, something else that we did, Mike designed this as well. It's students looking at two different types of educational systems, the Brits, the American, and then they can describe their educational system, comparing it to the American system. And how do we do this? We don't just ask them to compare. We can scaffold this activity by giving them some language here. Language for similarities, language. That's where, Sal, that's where the teaching can actually occur. If you can give them the task, ask them to compare. If you notice that the comparison is really bad, then you give them some language and then they do it again. Because what we want task repetition. Let the students do the task without the language, and then if you notice that they're struggling, then you give them the language, teach, and say, let's do it again. That way, they don't have to process content twice. They just have to focus on the language the second time.
I was going to say, you could even do that with the transcription task. You could have them read it, record themselves first, go through your scaffolding, and then record it again to see the difference.
Yes, yes. Good point, Andrew. Good point. And what makes this lesson pedagogically sound? Well, I would say this lesson taps into pretty much an entire list of sub-skills of listening. Some of them, of course, the ability to retain chunks of language of different lengths for short periods of time. Again, decoding, right? Just specific sounds, recognizing stress patterns, rhythm, structure, functions of stress and intonation, especially when they say, how many people are learning English worldwide? 2 billion, right? Reduced forms with connected speech, distinguishing word boundaries. A lot of this is actually explored in the intensive listening. Recognizing cohesive devices in spoken discourse, that is also happening in one of the previous stages. In this case, it would be probably what was that one? The listening for context and cotext. Yes, sorry. And of course, the ability to recognize syntactic patterns, devices, predict outcomes, check, inferencing, connections between events. That's also listening for context and cotext. Using real-world knowledge and experience to work out purpose, goal settings. That's when they're doing prediction. So they are using their knowledge of the topic to actually predict things. And of course, recognize coherence in discourse, main ideas, supporting ideas. When we ask them to focus, or when we ask them to identify the focus of each question, we're kind of testing or teaching the ability to recognize this in spoken discourse. Folks, final thoughts. If teachers plan listening lessons this way, we believe that learners are going to be provided with a range of listening purposes that will help them practice different ways of approaching a listening text. Again, our goal as teachers is to create an authentic reason for listening. And how do we, I don't think it's our job to motivate our students. I think our job is to create tasks that elicit the kind of motivation that we want our students to have. And of course, we are actually creating expectations for the content by asking them to predict. And we're giving them purpose. We're telling them why they should be listening to things, which will in turn motivate them to listen. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time. References, I would strongly recommend, if you want to learn more about listening, we're going to be doing a course on teaching listening where we're going to be designing tasks together. And this is a good book, Listening in the Language Classroom by John Field. We had to read that book. What else? Get in touch with us.
You mean we had the opportunity to read it? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, we had the opportunity to read it. We were forced to read it. Twitter, we're on Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, MailChimp. You can visit our website. You can subscribe to our website. If you want to send us a message, you can send us an email. We have a podcast, Teacher Talking Time. Once a month, we release an episode with researchers in the field of second language acquisition. We interviewed a Brazilian educator, Vini, and we have a webinar. 2 more coming up. We're not done. The webinar marathon is not finished yet. Michael is going to be taking over this one. It's Pedagogy Before Technology Part 2, the return, Wednesday, and a repeat on Friday at 8 p.m. I don't know if Michael is going to come because that's going to be like 1 a.m. in the UK. But then again, there is no tomorrow, right? We're all home. We're going to be on lockdown, so might as well. What else? If you liked what we're doing, we have a complete course online. It's Grammar for Teachers. And Mike, this is your turn. This is your baby now.
Oh, well, no, I mean, it's not mine. It's actually finally, after many requests, it's here, Leo. Drum roll. So the LYE membership. So yeah, so basically we've been putting together a membership for students, and a lot of people have been asking us, what about a membership for teachers? So finally we've committed to it, and we're going to launch it from April 1st. And basically it's affordable professional development, and we're trying to basically take advantage of all the things we're already doing, but to maybe tailor them towards your own professional development. So basically, we're going to be running webinars. However, if you're a member, they're included in the membership. Each month, we're going to have 30-day challenges related to actual classroom practice or online classroom practice, in which we live it with you, and we support each other through that process. Again, we already have our newsletter and the podcasts. So the members will be working with tasks related to those. So the topics that are covered in those podcasts will be used as part of this monthly challenge and the overall professional development experience. And again, we're going to try and make this, it's going to be it's going to be formally encapsulated. I'm so excited. Formally encapsulated into a classroom experience. So we will be doing discussion tasks, again, related to the newsletter, the podcast, the webinars. And we hope, and this was the big one that a lot of people requested, we actually want to have you publishing so that you can put this on your resume and, again, collect these professional development hours. So through publishing on our blog and through participating in roundtable discussions, or even leading those roundtable discussions, you'll be able to put that on your resume. And if you sign up in the first month, then you don't have to worry about the price ever going up for the entire time. And Leo, next slide. We had a lot to get through. People, you also get 50% discounts on all these other courses that we have available and are coming available. In particular, the short workshop that Leo mentioned earlier about designing materials for reading and writing. That is part of the LYE Cube course, in which case it's 3 intensive sessions where we meet live for about 90 minutes. We have a self-study or design phase attached to that. And then again, you would come back and then share your design and improve it. And then of course you would publish that, and we'd help you facilitate that. So really it's just, we've had people ask us how they can get involved. We want to facilitate that. And we think that this is the best way to do professional development, not necessarily through one-off courses, but through an actual genuine community. And that's what we're going for. So we'd love for you to join, and or your school to join. And of course, stay tuned for the live launch, which is, again, it's going to happen in April, but we're just trying to get through all of these workshops first so we can again, find out from you and figure out the best time to host this live event, because we have so many different time zones at play. So stay tuned.
I mean, we have 5 minutes for questions. If anyone wants to ask us any questions, you can just type them in the chat.
So a couple, Leo, will the PowerPoint be available? And I think that there's an answer to that. And then secondly, will this be posted? And yes, we are going to make the recording posted. But Leo, the materials, because you talked through the materials.
We're going to make available a PDF on the website. So when you go to the website, there's going to be a PDF version, not of the slides, but of the lesson, how we design the lesson. Actually, the entire lesson, this whole English Mania lesson, we were trying to prove to a lot of schools, to a lot of teachers, and to people who are designing this syllabus. We were trying to prove to them that with one TED Talk, you can actually teach classes for maybe 2 to 3 weeks. So what we've decided to do is we use this English Mania, and we've decided a lesson that includes the listening, it includes reading, it includes writing, it includes speaking, it includes grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. So with one TED Talk, we designed an entire, it's basically almost like I don't like this word because I have some sort of a trauma related to this word. It's almost like a course pack, but it's a lesson pack. So with this lesson pack, you can actually teach for maybe 2 to 3 weeks without having to say, every week I have to every week I have to use 3 TED Talks. No, I think you just need 1 TED Talk, and you just really need to learn how to milk the material for what it's worth. Any more questions?
I guess, Lila, I got one because I asked you one. This is a repeat of the one we did on Friday.
Yes.
Do you remember the question I asked you at the end on
Oh,
Friday?
yes. What was the question? I forget. I always forget.
I asked you because we designed this lesson as obviously an in-class face-to-face session, but when we've conducted it online, what changed for you in terms of its delivery?
Nothing changed.
Right.
I would strongly argue that there is absolutely no difference between the way you deliver this in a classroom and the way you deliver this lesson online. And again, I find that teachers are becoming overwhelmed with all these different tools, all these, again, I get it. The tools are great, but you have to ask yourself, what kind of learning outcome are you trying to achieve with those tools, right? I think Manuel asked a good question. Is this lesson based on a task-based learning or the communicative approach? I would say there's a little bit of both. There's a little bit of both. There are tasks, and of course, there is communication there. Maria said, I have a question. You mentioned that when we ask students to take notes, they write everything down. How can we break that bad habit? I think this is why it's important to listen for co-text. You choose the words that are important, that you deem important in that talk, and then they can take notes around those words, right? So you're kind of teaching them how to take notes by scaffolding the approach to note-taking. People are asking about certificates. If you want to get a certificate, you have to join the webinar, because yesterday I got a request from someone, I didn't watch the webinar, can I get a certificate? And the answer is no, you cannot get a certificate. And by the way, what are you going to do with that certificate? It's just a piece of paper. But anyway, if you need a certificate, a PD record, send us an email, info@learnyourenglish, and we can provide a certificate. Michael said whiskey now. For me, something else. Plasmin TBL is communicative. Yes, I agree. Slightly different, but TBL emphasizes a lot of communication. So communication is Plasmin. I agree with you. Communication is at the core of task-based language teaching.
Or at least it's meaning focused, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. We appreciate your
that was really fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
It was very engaging, actually. Great audience today. And hopefully we'll see you all on Wednesday or Friday, whichever one.
This is going to be available, right? It's going to be available.
It will be available, yes. And stay tuned for the membership, because we're really
There's one more question here.
That.
We have one more.
Oh, sorry.
Sal says, can we apply this approach to different types of listening clips? I would argue, Sal, that you can apply this to any listening texts that you want.
Any receptive task, I would say, right?
I mean, if you're interested, I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to stop the recording.